So next up is Dr. Jordan, and he is a clinical associate professor of neurology at UCLA and USC. He has a private practice in Santa Monica, California, and he has taught 2 interventional programs at UCLA and helped establish the stroke service at UCLA and Providence St. John's Health Center. He's authored numerous books and journal articles. He lectures nationally and internationally on brain health and regeneration. And as chief investigator for the Regenesis Project, Dr. Jordan advances the boundaries of neurologic care through the exploration of cutting-edge and targeted approaches for brain health and regeneration. Thank you for being here with us.
Good afternoon, everybody. So hopefully you've seen my first and second lectures. This is going to be the third in a series of 5 that will make everybody an expert neurologist in functional medicine. So that's what we're all looking for. So this particular lecture is how to protect the brain in a toxic planet. And honestly, growing up in New York City, I have to admit it, I wasn't much of a tree hugger. In fact, I didn't trust air I couldn't see. Now that I've grown a few years older and I've seen the effects of the environment and toxic exposure on patients. And having being an avid outdoorsman, sailing and kayaking and swimming, and seeing what happens to the Pacific Ocean after a little bit of rain hits the ground and all those toxins get washed into the ocean, I've become a big believer and a big worrier. And what I want to impart today is not just what we should be worrying about, but what we can do to change our lives and to change our planet. So we're going to identify sources of toxic exposure. We're going to understand how different forms of toxin can affect the brain differently and require a different response from us. And then we're going to discuss ways that we can perhaps remediate toxin exposure. So we talk about the exposome. The exposome includes the air we breathe, the water we drink, the light that we surround ourselves with, the food we eat, the biome, those single-cell organisms that want to bring us back to the primordial soup. They're living within our bodies, and some of them are pretty disruptive. So what do we do to keep them happy? And there's also radiation. So let's first talk about air pollution in urban environments. Here we see a very interesting picture that's taken from space. We're just looking at cities in North America. It's amazing how much light comes from some of these areas of dense urban populations. I want to spend some time talking about the little bit of light in Mexico, in the center of Mexico, that little bright light area, not so little, is Mexico City. Mexico City is a very interesting place that has taught us a lot about air and how air and the environment can affect the brain of vulnerable individuals. If you take a similar picture and look at pollutants from space, if you look down in Mexico, there's a very bright little spot. Again, not so little, in the center of Mexico, highly polluted. So Mexico City is one of the most polluted places on the planet. Here's one of my drawings about Mexico City. This is what it looks like on a clear day. You're looking through a dense smog, through buildings that look like mere shadows, and the distant mountains that rise above the smog line. Now, very much like Los Angeles, which is the basin that I live in, Mexico City is shaped like a basin. So it's ringed by mountains. You can see those very tall mountains on the north end and on the east end. And there is an ability for air to come in from the west. And as most of you know, in North America, there's the prevalent winds are westerlies. So they come in from the west. But what happens in Mexico City, the air gets trapped because we have this ring of mountains. So as air comes in, it doesn't have a way to wash the air through. It gets trapped, and the smog, the pollutants, get kept within that basin. Very much like the Los Angeles that I live in. So if you look at a microscopic image on the right, you can see there's little particles. These are metallic microparticles or nanoparticles. They're very tiny. We're going to talk about how tiny they are because it's extremely important when you understand what's in the air if you want to filter them and take an action against this. So these are metallic particles that are in the air. On your left are metallic particles in the brain of a child. So what this child breathed in is now in the brain. You can also look at these particles coming out of diesel exhaust. But you might say, well, this is easy. Let's just get rid of fossil fuels. And let's just do more commuting with urban commuting systems, railways, and so on. It turns out that a lot of these metallic particles don't come from diesel exhaust. They come from brakes. So the trains, the buses, the trolleys, when they brake, inevitably they have to slow down and stop. The friction between the braking mechanism creates metallic particles that are extremely small, that are released into the air and get breathed in by everyone, including our children. So the group headed up by Calderon has looked at this in some detail, and they're able to detect what metals actually make up these little microparticles. So there's iron, but there's other copper and other agents that are in these microparticles. This is maybe the most important slide that I'll show you in terms of air pollution. These particles are extremely small. They run about 20 to 30 nanometers. Now, when you understand these so-called HEPA filters that you hear about, and maybe you have these in your home, you know they have them in airplanes. They boast about HEPA filters. These are like amazing. No, they're not. Because HEPA filters only filter at greater than 100 nanometers. They don't do anything for these tiny microparticles. Here's a child with the changes that you see with Alzheimer's disease. So Garcidenas Calderon has looked at children in Mexico City dying of unnatural causes, suicide, homicide. Alzheimer's disease in children is not the same as Alzheimer's disease in elderly individuals. They look like behavioral disturbances. They look like mood disorders. And what she did was, this researcher did, is she looked at these children dying of suicide and homicide and looked at their brains, and lo and behold, they've got Alzheimer's disease changes. They have amyloid plaque, neurofibrillary tangles. So if you went to my first lecture, you know that the amyloid plaques are part of the brain's response to inflammation and a challenge from the outside. So it is an innate immune system response. I use the analogy that if you had a room full of flies buzzing around, you might throw out some fly paper with the hope that some of those flies would stick to it. So amyloid plaque is sticky. It's fly paper for the brain. So when these microparticles get breathed into the nose, get breathed into the mouth and then swallowed, and they're so tiny, they fit between the interstices between cells. Think of it, 20 nanometers. A red cell, after all, is 10 microns. Hundreds of times larger. If you look at a map of the pollution in Mexico City, you can see those darker colors in the northeast is where the pollution is its worst. That's at the base of those mountains. That's where all of that pollution is being trapped. If you look at the income of people living in these different areas, and here the color scheme is that the darker colors are the richer people, and the light yellows are the poorer people. Seems to correspond. So poor people have the privilege of living in the most polluted areas. So you might come to the conclusion that committing suicide and being a victim of a homicide just relates to being in a bad socioeconomic area. You might have that conclusion. However, this group in Mexico City did the following experiment. They looked at other known factors for Alzheimer's disease, like the presence of ApoE4. ApoE4 is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And these children dying of suicide and dying of homicide, they not only had evidence of these changes like Alzheimer's disease in the brain, they also had ApoE4 genetics. They also had excess tau, which is the other protein that accumulates with Alzheimer's disease. So here you have children in polluted areas of Mexico City who are committing suicide and being subject to homicide. And when you look at their brains, they look like the brain of a 70-year-old. And you can look at this material in a graphic form as well, that if they have ApoE4, there's a very strong relationship to the amount of pollution and the amount of changes that look like Alzheimer's disease. This is not the only group that looks at this relationship between pollution and degenerative disease. Here's another group, I believe it was from England, that looked at the incidence of dementia related to how close you live to a major roadway. So if you live next to lots of traffic, you have a higher incidence of getting dementia. So those pollutants have a dose-response relationship. The closer to pollution, the more dementia. The further away, the less dementia. So what we can conclude so far about urban environments is that being in a polluted area definitely changes the brain. It produces the kinds of pathology that you see with Alzheimer's disease and appears in children to increase the risk of suicide and homicide, and in older individuals, if you live next to a trafficky area, you can count on having a higher incidence of dementia. So how about rural environments? I'll just pack up my stuff from Brooklyn and move out in a town. I'll go out to Long Island, I'll go out to the East End, and I'll have ocean air, and I'll be just fine. Not necessarily. We've known for a very long time, this is an old article from 1998 Neurology Journal, the risk of exposure to pesticides increases the risk of Parkinson's disease. We've known this now for quite a long time. This particular group looked at all sorts of things that relate to being in a rural environment. And if you look at this whole list, the biggest factor is, what is it? Exposure to herbicides and insecticides. So it's not just the fact that you're living in a rural area. That may not be so bad. But if you're exposed to herbicides and insecticides, the chances are extraordinary that you're going to have an increased risk of Parkinson's. I have my colleagues in parts of California which are known for their agriculture, and they have to hire extra neurologists just to see the Parkinson's patients. Well, how about, I'm going to move out of Brooklyn, and I'm going to start playing golf. Because I'm going to get that fresh air, I'm going to get that exercise, I'm going to walk every day, and boy, I love golf. Well, this is very disconcerting. Living downwind of a golf course also increases the risk of Parkinson's. Why is that? Because you got to keep the grass green. How do you keep the grass green? Herbicides, pesticides. It turns out that these different herbicides and pesticides work on the brain and body in different ways. Some of them are mitochondrial poisons, and for many people, Parkinson's appears to have a mitochondrial relationship. So here's where certain nutritional supplements may be more important than others when they're exposed to these sorts of pesticides. It's not just Parkinson's disease, it's also Alzheimer's disease. So when individuals have looked at the organochlorine pesticides, this is DDT and DDE. So DDT was the original product, and you're saying, for heaven's sakes, Dr. Jordan, that's been off the market for decades. Well, you know what? It's not. They have it in many countries outside the United States, and I'm seeing one individual now, I can't mention his name. When he was a kid, lived next to some farms, and he and his friends thought it would be really cool to follow the spraying machinery that was spraying all the farms in his area. So they'd follow on the bikes and get the cool spray on them. They thought that was like really cool. In fact, it was cool. It was hot on the East Coast, and they'd get that cooling mist. They'd say, this is great. And now, this individual has something that looks like a combination of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. There was a landmark article that was published in JAMA, JAMA, it was 2014, that actually looked at the exposure to organopesticides in Alzheimer's disease, and here you can see the graphic. The same group looked at cell cultures and they exposed the kinds of concentrations of organopesticides that you might be exposed to just living in a rural environment. And sure enough, it gets fixed by the cells and it kills them. These are nerve cells in culture. So as I said, you have to know the toxin. They don't all work the same. So DDT and DDE, which is its main metabolite, also changes the clearance of amyloid. So as you get older, there is some problem with clearance, and that's one of the reasons why people get Alzheimer's disease, is that they are unable to clear out these abnormal proteins as they accumulate in the brain. Well, it turns out that DDT and DDE inhibits your body's ability to metabolize, so it actually blocks the autophagy step. So here's a situation where you might use a nutritional supplement or a drug. Rather than focusing on mitochondria, you might focus on something that enhances autophagy. So what can we do preventative-wise? Don't live near or downwind from a major road or high traffic. That, to me, is obvious. Consider at-home working environments whenever feasible. The thing that really blew me away, literally blew me away, that map of toxin over North America. I showed you the one from 2019, right before COVID. If I showed you a map of 2020, you don't see any pollution, or very little. Why is that? Everybody's staying home. I don't know if you all remember, but this was true about my neck of the woods. When COVID first broke out, there was no traffic. People were working from home. People were taking their work benefits. There wasn't a lot of traffic being created. The subways were not running. The buses were not running. So all these different things that created toxin disappeared. And when you took a map from outer space, there was very little pollution. So one thing that we can all do to help the environment is to work at home as much as you possibly can. So my advice is make telemedicine as much of your practice as you possibly can. And hopefully the authorities that determine whether you can or can't bill for your time, to the extent that we can get away with remote follow-up for certain things, it would be a nice thing that we can do for the environment. So, if you're going to work at home, we need to filter the air. Because for heaven's sakes, I live in Los Angeles. Now, I don't live by a highway. I do live by the beach. That's good. But I still have these nanoparticles floating around. So what do? I have an air filter that filters down to less than 30 nanometers. That's what you need. That is only a fraction of the air filters that are on the market. Most of the ones that you buy are touting it's a HEPA filter. It's going to take care of all those toxins. No, they are not. You need to get something that's going to filter down to 20 and 30 nanometers. That's what you need to get rid of urban pollution. Now, this is a CME course, so I won't give names, but when you twist my arm in the hallway, I'll tell you some commercial products that are on the market that actually filter down to that level. We're going to talk more about plastics and microfibers, but the other thing you can do is not use the tumble-dry cycle. All those plastic-containing garments that you wear, that I'm wearing, when we put it in tumble-dry, we're causing little nanoparticles that you're also inhaling. We're going to be talking more about plastic in just a little bit. But you want to just hang dry things. And, wow, barbecues, fireplaces, and mold. These are all things we have to think about. So here we talked about different commercial products and how they go down to 30 nanometers There's only one product that I know of that's regularly commercially available that does this. Most of them are in that 37% range. They're ordinary HEPA filters. They don't filter out urban pollution sufficiently well. Now, it turns out we were talking a little bit about the organopesticides. They actually do have an enterohepatic circulation. So everybody in this audience knows what you can do. Here's an opportunity for some of your binding agents. So if you have some individual who's coming in with memory impairment and maybe they lived on a farm, maybe they had some pesticide exposure, there may be some way of getting rid of these things. Nobody has really published on this, but it seems to me if you can do this without causing any harm, it's another option you can offer. Mitochondrial support for those pesticides that act on mitochondria, autophagy for DDT. Plasmalogen precursors, there's always an inflammatory component, and there's an injurious component to membranes, so the plasmalogen precursors that we're talking about in the first talk would be something to be considered. I don't know about other chelation activities, but that might be something to think about. So I'm not going to speak a lot about food because other people are going to be speaking a lot about food. But there's something that I find to be really worth talking about, especially, and that is organic pesticides. That's sort of like military intelligence, right? It's like, it doesn't seem to make sense. Organic pesticides, what does that mean? Well, it turns out that you can use the organic label as long as it's a naturally occurring substance. Now, until I learned about this, I was eating lots of kale, lettuce, all these green leafy vegetables. Guess what? They're all sprayed with organic pesticides. Well, you can say, well, maybe they're not toxic to humans. They've been around forever. They're naturally occurring. That's not the point. The point is that if it kills anything living and it gets inside your body, it's going to kill those good bugs that make up your biome. You want those bifidobacteria to be alive. You don't want the Bacteroides to take over and give you a lot of bad bugs and cause the inflammation that adds to a degenerative process in the brain. Let's talk about water. We talked about air. Let's talk about water. Anybody want to sip? What's in this bottle? Ah, that tasted good. It's plastic. So guess what happened when I unscrewed the top? I just caused little shards of plastic to go into the water. And I just drank it down. And you know what? It tasted pretty good. But that plastic never leaves your body. And we found by looking at various kinds of organisms, it gets into your brain. Just like those nanoparticles that you get from exhaust. Would you stick your mouth on the exhaust pipe of a diesel engine? I wouldn't, not even on a dare. Not even when I was a kid living in Brooklyn would I do that. But that's what I just did. So, like I said, I like the outdoors, I like to kayak, I like to sail, I like to swim. I'm on the Pacific Ocean. This is a scene that I see when I walk down the beach. And this is where I stopped being an anti-tree hugger and became an environmental activist. And our local society is Save the Bay, and they've done an amazing job in trying to clean up this water, but it's a hard job. It's a hard job. There's a lot of plastic out there. It's been said that there's floating plastic in the Pacific Ocean that's bigger than North America. But any piece of plastic that was ever created is never destroyed. There's no bug that naturally occurs that digests plastic. It doesn't exist in nature. So what happens? Every piece of plastic gets broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller sizes. It gets dissolved in our water. It evaporates with the water. It gets blown out of our topsoil and ascends to the heavens only to come down as rain. And that goes into all the spring water that they proudly talk about in these bottles. So the spring water is polluted. And then you just put it in plastic, and you make the whole cycle worse again. We don't need to go into the weeds about some of the graphic stuff that people have done. But microplastic, nanoplastics, nanoparticles, kills plankton. The plankton eat it, they die. It gets eaten by the next critter in the chain. And it works its way up to humans and other animals. Those nanoplastics go to the brain. You can see them in fish. And it changes behavior in fish. If you put fish in an environment with nanoplastics dissolved in it, they actually do not behave like normal fish. They have the equivalent of Alzheimer's disease in a fish. Well, you say, I live in Los Angeles, I live in New York City. They have a water treatment plant. That's purifying my water. There's an organization called EWG. Look up your locality, go to their website, and see all the pollutants that are floating around in your home water supply. You can't factor this stuff out. They're organic molecules, they're dissolved. You're washing, you're bathing. You may be drinking this, but I don't know. I'd have a hard time doing that. But look at all of these toxins in there. Arsenic, bromate, chromium, nitrates. Nitrates, of course, come from fertilizer, right? And they get washed into the water supply. Uranium. What's that doing in there? Now you might say, well, it's been certified. It's government approved. It's legal. I would propose to you that the difference between what's legal and what's healthy living on this planet for 70 years are two different things. So what can we do? This is not just about worrying. This is about being proactive. So it is possible to use carbon filters and something called reverse osmosis to get rid of most of these toxic elements that are in your water supply. Now, the reverse osmosis is really critical here because it gets out the nanoparticles. It gets out these particles that are in the 30 to 100 nanometer range. So these microplastics that are in your drinking water and any of those metallic particles that we talked about from Mexico City, which are also in your environment, that get into the water supply, those can be filtered out with a combination of carbon filtration and reverse osmosis. The key about reverse osmosis is that it goes down to very, very tiny particle sizes. There are many commercially available units that you can put underneath your sink, and if you're a renter, there are above-the-counter reverse osmosis agents that you can buy. So all of your water can be filtered down to 20, 30 nanometers and also have a carbon filter. Well, I said if it kills bugs in the environment, what do you think it does in your body? So we're adding chlorinated material to our drinking supply. They certainly do that in Los Angeles. I suspect they do it in your locality. So when you drink that water, it's ending up in your gut and it's killing the good bacteria that make up your healthy biome. So your biome is going to be dependent on your drinking water. Again, you can get this out with serial carbon and reverse osmosis. You can get rid of the chlorine. So you don't have to live with this. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was light pollution. This is a topic I didn't really know much about, and it's fascinating. So this whole thing about the hypothalamic pineal axis and how it relates to aging and aging gracefully and aging fast or slow and eventually dying, it's very dependent on how much melatonin is being created by the pineal gland. Well, it turns out that if you have light in the blue wavelength range, it inhibits melatonin production and release. So I don't know about you guys, but I kind of like to look at Netflix, see some old movies before I fall asleep at night. In fact, I may be a little bit of a workaholic. Not that any of you are workaholics like I am, but I might look at my laptop and start working late at night until I fall asleep. Well, guess what? There's lots of blue light there. And, oh, by the way, the lights in my house are daylight lights. Because when I went to the hardware store, there was a nice sign that said natural daylight. Isn't that what I want for the lights in my house? I'm going back to this original map. There's a lot of blue light being spread around the big urban centers in the United States and Mexico. And there's that reflex. The retina sees the blue light. It sends a signal that concatenates through the nervous system and inhibits the release of melatonin from the pineal gland. That's the reflex. In the old days, we had red light, red and yellow light, right? Think about the 1800s, the 1700s. We had candlelight, we had fireplaces. We didn't have electric light bulbs. So we were not exposed to blue light when we were indoors. I would point out that Alzheimer's disease was unheard of in the 1800s. The biggest cause of dementia was actually syphilis. So could it be part of the reason why we're in such an epidemic of Alzheimer's disease is that we're now exposed to all this blue light, we're suppressing our melatonin, and if you saw my first lecture, the melatonin is what keeps the stem cells in the hypothalamus alive that allows your biological clock to maintain a youthful signal. When you lose that youthful signal because the stem cells don't get their melatonin that they deserve and that they require, you become old and you die. Also, your brain starts to deteriorate. So this is one of my drawings of a typical family in the 1950s. You'll notice me in front of the TV set. So in those days, we had black and white TV. It wasn't until Bonanza came out that we had a color show to watch. But everything was sort of a blue, ghastly color. And I was putting my face right in that TV. So, I should have lived to be 120. And here I am struggling, so maybe I shouldn't have been in front of the TV when I was a kid. So if we're going to use melatonin to circumvent this reflex, we have to know how to use it properly. If you take an oral dose of immediate release melatonin, it only lasts for a few hours. And we know that if you look at individuals that have a cannula in their third ventricle and you measure melatonin, the melatonin during the nighttime is up for the entire night. Hours, not just a couple of hours. So if you want to simulate what a normal pineal gland would do to keep your hypothalamus alive and youthful, you want to give melatonin throughout the whole night. So you need to use a sustained release melatonin. So here's actually the recording from a child who has a ventricular shunt. If you give this child melatonin and you actually measure the amount of melatonin from an oral pill that ends up in the ventricle in the brain, that single pill only gives you a couple of hours of melatonin. So this is as good a kinetic study as I've ever seen. So we're talking about the end result is you want to get that melatonin to the hypothalamus. You don't get a normal amount by giving a immediate release melatonin. You have to give a sustained release melatonin. So we don't have time to talk about radiation exposure, but there's a lot we can talk about astronauts and the exposure to radiation. The one thing that really comes up for the average individual is radon. If you have a basement, the ground can actually have a substantial amount of radon. You want to make sure that that's ameliorated. So let me just summarize how we survive a brain in a toxic planet. So we can breathe clean air by living in a rural environment or using air purifiers, but make sure that the specs are correct. You have to be able to filter out those tiny nanoparticles. For drinking, avoid tap water and avoid using water from plastic bottles. Use a purifier with reverse osmosis, the ability to filter down to the nanoparticle size. Protect the biome with an avoidance of antibiotics. So we shouldn't be just throwing antibiotics around and changing our biome, of course. The choice of foods and cleaning of vegetables and fruits are obviously an important one when even organic pesticides become an issue. And of course, we should minimize radiation exposure. So those are all the comments I wanted to make. So I think what you've seen is a transition of someone who is not much of a tree hugger to someone who's really concerned about the environment. So those are all the things I wanted to say. Thank you so much.